Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to be here again this morning. So we're going to be in 1 Peter again, chapter 1. If you want to look in a few Bibles on page 857. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version today, not the NIV, but if you want to use a few Bibles, you can start there. So I want you to think about something for a second, begin to frame our minds for today's sermon. If a person gave you a gift, how grateful would you be?
Very grateful.
Very grateful?
Depends on the gift.
Depends. Yeah, depends. Okay, depends on what?
Gift.
Yeah.
The gift?
Do I like it?
Do I like it?
Do I want it?
Do I want it? Do I need it?
Is it cluttering?
It's cluttering my house.
Is it really a gift at all?
Is it a gift? So there's different things that go into this. I thought about, the nature, whether it's essential or not. You absolutely need it. That'd be important versus you don't, but it's nice. The cost could come into how grateful you are, and especially when that comes into terms of maybe the sacrifice that person made to give you that gift. Maybe sentimental value for them, and they gave it to you anyway. And your relationship with the person. That can enter into it as well. So, yeah, how grateful are you? Well, it depends on a lot of things. Last week, we looked at this idea of remember what we have, and what we have as Christians is salvation. The three elements of that, the aspects. We have been justified, forgiven immediately when we become a Christian. We are continually being transformed as the Spirit works in us. And one day we will be glorified. We will receive our heavenly bodies and we will live in eternity with God in heaven, our inheritance that it was talked about. So remember what you have, especially in light. Remember those people had been persecuted, were forced to flee from their homes, and he's saying, have this perspective. Salvation is the most important thing. Use that to have a perspective on the things that you're facing now for a little while, relatively. Well, today, we're going to talk about, remember how we got it. How did we get this salvation? And as we think about and apply that to being grateful for a gift, well, think about it. Salvation, is it essential? Absolutely. What was the cost? Immense. Yeah. Sentimental value. God the Father sent his Son. Sacrifice. Jesus gave up his life and suffered for our sins. And then the relationship with that person, we were created to have a relationship with God. There is a God-shaped void, and if he's not there, something drastic is missing. And so all of that tells us we should be extremely grateful for our salvation because of how we got it. So I want to look at this passage today, verses 13 through 21. As I said, as we go through this, however long my time is here, I really want you to focus on how do I dig into a passage. There's just some basic principles. And the first one is, as you read through a passage, you want to try to find the subject. And then you want to find the lesson. Okay, what's it saying about the subject? And the easiest way to begin to do that is look for words that are repeated, or in this case, words that are related. So we're going to see some repeated words. We're also going to see some words that are different, but they all sort of tie in together. So try to listen for that. I know it's not as easy. I go over it several times and begin to see the things there. But I just want you to see how that works. So chapter 1, verses 13 through 21 says, "Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. But as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. Since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And if you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. He was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. All right, what words stood out to you there?
Holy.
Holy, 4 times. You see the word holy.
Hope.
Hope, 2 times. And then there's some words that are related. Again, a little harder because just one read through. But the words minds, minded, ignorance, and knowing all focus in on the same type of thing, our mind, our thinking, what we know. And then the words obedience, conduct, and conduct. So the noun and the verb form there all talk about what we do, our behavior. So it begins to give you an idea. You look at those things, it begins to focus. All right, what is this passage about? What's the subject and what is being said there? And what I want us to do to help continue that focus is focus on this question. How aware am I of the cost of my salvation? How aware am I of the cost of my salvation? I believe that's what Peter is giving us, wants us to focus on here. So let's dig in. Verse 13 starts with this word therefore. Do you remember the rule whenever you see the word therefore?
Why is it there? What is it there for?
What is it there for? Yeah. And it always refers to something that has happened and been said, been shown previously. Okay? Therefore, in light of what I just said, the author is saying this. And so, what has he talked about? Well, again, what we looked at last week. This idea of salvation. As believers, we are saved. We have been forgiven. We are being transformed. We will be glorified and spend eternity with God in heaven. That's our inheritance. And so he says, therefore, in light of that, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded. So there's, again, a couple things you see easily related. Preparing your minds for action. Some of the older translations saying, gird up your minds. And it's the idea that in that day, people would wear the long robes, and if they needed to do something, especially if they needed to run, you wouldn't want to do that. You'd bring it up, you'd tie it up, and that would prepare you for that action. And so he's saying, prepare your minds, whatever it takes to get ready, to be ready to use your minds, based on this thing I've said, based on what you know, and being sober-minded. And so that's the thought of, disciplined in a way, but also even keeled, like I'm acting in regard to what I know is true, not letting outside things influence me. So together it's saying, be ready for action. And they're both focused on our minds, on our thinking. And that is key. People talk about it, and at times I see it. It's not based on what you know. It's not based on theology or doctrine. It's all about Jesus. Well, everything we know about Jesus is doctrine and theology. It is important. The Bible continually emphasizes the importance of knowledge. Now, not just knowledge alone, but it begins with that. Certainly our transformation. Romans says, be transformed how? By the renewing of your mind. That is going to shape and focus everything we do, is how we view things. And so we need to renew our minds. And that's what Peter's saying here. In light of what I reminded you of, okay, be ready to live this certain way. Be ready for action. Set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Again, this idea of hope, it's like faith with a specific promise. Faith in and of itself is to be in God. And you would say, I have faith that God will do this unless he told you he's going to do it. And then that becomes hope. I have this hope. And it has this broader sense, too, when we talk about it. Someone's lost all hope. What is it that just gets me by? And that's what he's saying. Set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you. And so often we have other things as our hope. And we lose those, something goes wrong, we say, I have no hope. Well, as believers, we always have hope. Whatever we're facing in life, however dire and dark things are, we have this promise that we will spend eternity with God in heaven. We have been forgiven. We have this relationship now. It will last forever. He says, set your hope fully on that. Fully. Not just, okay, I've got hope in God, but boy, I'm just going to be devastated if this happens or this doesn't happen. Again, it doesn't mean things aren't difficult. These people were exiled from their homes, and that was not something. People didn't move back then. You know, you didn't have a moving van to take. If you went somewhere, I'll take everything with me. You know, they had to leave stuff behind. All right? This was devastating to them. But he says, set your hope, what truly gets you by, what you're grounded in. Set it fully on the grace. This idea of our salvation, saved by grace. Not just unmerited favor, but favor bestowed when wrath is owed. We got forgiveness when we deserved hell. All right? Set your hope on that grace. And then he talks about, and he's done this in that first part, he does it now. He focuses quite a bit on the future element of salvation. The grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So we've already been forgiven. We're being transformed. But that future, that inheritance where it all becomes, solidified, and from that point on, we're in eternity. We're spending eternity with God in heaven. He says, set your hope on that, and it will be fully revealed when Jesus comes again. As obedient children, verse 14. He talked earlier about God the Father. In verse 17, he's going to say again, God is Father. And there's a lot of ways you can refer to God. God the Creator, God the Lord. But here he does Father, and in light of that, he says, if God's the Father, we're his children, and children are to be obedient. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. Again, it seems that Peter, even though he's the apostle to the Jews, was writing to Gentiles here. Because they certainly lived lives of total ignorance toward God. But in one sense, all believers. You could say that the Jews certainly had their times of ignorance. You see that throughout the Old Testament. But they did know, they just totally ignored it. They rejected it. Us as believers, wherever you started in life, maybe you grew up in the church. But still, hopefully we know more now than we did then. So whatever it is, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. Before you made this commitment to God, again, your way of looking at things was not the same. But don't be like that now. Live as obedient children. He says, instead of being conformed to those passions, verse 15, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. Since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. It occurs twice in the Old Testament. In Exodus and Leviticus, God says, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Isaiah 6:3 says, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. It's the only time in the Bible that a word's repeated 3 times, and that's how they emphasize something. Instead of saying very, very, they would repeat the word. Holy, holy, holy. Well, what's that word mean? We use it all the time as believers. What does it mean to be holy? Well, holy literally means cut off from, separate from, okay? And in one sense, it's anything that's separate from the world, from normal use and specifically sinful use when it comes to our behavior, and set apart to God. In the Old Testament, they had holy forks. They had a holy perfume recipe. It was separate from all the other recipes. You couldn't use that recipe to make perfume. It was set apart to God. Only the priests could do that for their worship to God. So it's this idea of being separate from normal use and set apart to God. Well, as you talk about behavior and holy in light of sin, it is separate from sin. God is holy. He has nothing to do with sin. And for us, it's to be separate from the world and the world's opposite of view, the way God views things, and to be set apart. I'm committed, I'm dedicated to God. That's what it means to be holy. Now, we will never be perfectly holy. You shall be holy, for I am holy, it says. But that's the mark. Our goal shouldn't be, well, I want to be 50% holy. I want to be sort of holy. More holy than not holy. Our goal should be, I want to be holy as God is holy. All right? That's what I'm going for. Again, we won't be there. God knows that. But don't set our sights lower than that. Be holy, for God is holy. Verse 17, and if you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. Now, this verse is really the one that got me interested. I read this passage, I don't know, a few months ago. Boy, I want to preach a sermon on this. And the reason is that word exile. And it's from verse 1. Remember, he called them exiles. They were persecuted, forced to leave their homes, flee to other areas where there was more safety. And so they were exiles. And then he says this here, your time of exile. And so I connected that, and he's talking this time of this persecution and having to flee. But that's interesting, because in the New American Standard, it says your stay on earth, and in the NIV it says while you were foreigners here. So they took that word, and it can mean both. Not as that specific exile because of being persecuted, but the idea that as believers, as the song says, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. During your time, you stay on earth. And in one sense, it really doesn't matter which one it is, because either way, as one song says that I like, we're living now on the south side of heaven. All right? And so whether it's talking about life in general, or whether it's talking about a specific, in him here, the specific time of persecution, we face things here on earth that are difficult, that are trials, that are suffering, that we won't experience in heaven. And so he's saying, during your time of experiencing suffering, of trials, is what he's talking about. And notice he starts it off. He says, if you call on God as Father. Well, what's that talking about? Calling on God. What do we call that? When we call on God? Prayer, yeah. Yeah, so if you pray to God, well, what's the common focus of our prayer? Me. And things that are going on. There's nothing wrong with having an element of our prayers that God says, please work, God, please work in this area of life. Please do something in regard to this situation. And notice he says, if you call on him as Father. Well, we do pray to God, and we certainly pray to God and ask him for things. And if you were experiencing exile, whatever that means, you're even more inclined. Even people who don't pray much pray when things are going rough. And so you're like, if you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds. Now, to me, that was a wait a minute phrase, verse. As you're going through a passage and something makes you say, wait a minute, how does this fit with this other passage or this other principle that I know? And here it says, God the Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds or works. Well, wait a minute. Doesn't the Bible say we're saved by faith, not by works? And here it says God judges impartially according to each one's works. Well, what's going on there? The point is, we are saved, but we're saved from what our works and we deserve. And that's what he's bringing up here. That's what he's emphasizing here. That God judges impartially, and according to that judgment, we all deserve eternal separation from God. This is the point of the passage in Revelation that talks about the books, plural, and the book of life. Revelation 20, verses 12 to 13 and 15, John writes, he says, I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books, plural, were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, plural, according to what they had done. So this is saying that at some point, when it all comes down, everyone who's ever lived is going to be judged according to what they've done. Everything you've ever done are written in the books. A little scary, huh? And the idea here, and just as we realize judgment in general, it's not like we're going to get to heaven and find out what our eternal destiny is. Certainly as believers, we know. But it's more pronouncing the sentence. And this is God's way of letting everyone know what I'm about to decree is just. Here's what you did in life. And according to what's written in the books, every one of us deserves eternal punishment. Every one of us has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But then verse 15 says, and if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. So the idea is, according to what we've done, according to our deeds and our works, we all deserve hell. But everyone whose name is written in the book of life, those who have accepted salvation, will not get what they deserve. We have been forgiven. We will get our inheritance that Peter's been talking about here. Well, he says, conduct yourselves with fear. So as you think about this and think about that, Conduct yourselves with fear. Now, that word we often have trouble with as Christians. Like, well, that's hardly a good relationship. If you fear someone, we're in a relationship with God. And some people will, well, it's reverence. And even the NIV I saw translates it reverent fear. That's certainly the idea, but there should be this element of a healthy fear of God. The way I like to describe it is if there was a lion, and that's certainly a good image for God. So a full-grown, large, ferocious lion, and he had the collar, the harness, whatever, and he was chained to a post, absolutely could not get past a certain point. And it had been determined where that point was. It's right there. He cannot reach past that. If you were standing a few inches outside of that point, and he came charging at you, what would you feel? Like, there's one element that I know he can't get me, but boy, that's a lion, and I'm awful close. That's sort of what this is. And the chain in this sense, if you want to take the analogy further, is God's own nature. God is not going to just, wipe us out in an instant. He could do that. He would be justified. That's not the way God is. His nature keeps him, from just doing that capriciously, on a whim. But he is God. He is God and we're not. There's a big element of humility when it talks about this fear of the Lord. Realize God is God. He's absolutely holy. I'm not God, and I'm not absolutely holy. I deserve his wrath. He is holding it back. And he has said he will, if we become a Christian, it's totally been absorbed, if you want to think of it, by Christ on the cross. But still have that fear, that attitude that says, don't think because of that God's just some kitten. He's still a roaring lion. He's just said, I won't devour you. Does that make sense? That's how we need to think about that. So conduct yourselves with fear. And then he adds this last phrase that we talked about a little bit, throughout your time of exile. And I thought about, well, why the focus on that? Whenever we pray to God, we should conduct ourselves with, this healthy fear, whether it's, in light of that exile or not. But I'm going to say that's what we're going to look at in depth here. Let's finish up this passage and then look at what I think Peter is focusing on. So verse 18, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. So he says, again, as you conduct yourselves with fear, knowing that you were ransomed. And that word it goes back to the way slavery worked in that day, that a slave could pay the price to set themselves free. And they could earn that money. They were able to do, slavery was different than the American version of slavery. They were able to do some extra work. They were able to do things. And so they could save up and ransom themselves, pay the price that was set on them by their master. Someone else could ransom them. So that's what this is talking about. We were slaves in bondage to sin, and we were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers. Again, probably talking about Gentiles. Not with perishable things, such as silver or gold. Well, silver and gold are pretty valuable, aren't they? They're like the most valuable things that you can think of, certainly in their time. But he says, as great as those are, they're perishable. If nothing else, they can be stolen, they can be lost, but they'll fade away in different aspects. And as great as those are, as valuable as those are, that wasn't what paid the price for our freedom. It was the precious blood of Christ, the Son of God, and his precious blood, that's talking about his death. He died in our place. He died in our place like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. In the Old Testament, that meant literally that. You didn't bring your, feeble, weak animal and you're, here, God, you can have this one. I didn't want him anyway. For Christ, it's talking about the fact that he sinless. He who absolutely did not deserve anything like the cross, he took it upon himself for us. Verse 20, he was foreknown before the foundation of the world. That means more than just, God knew it was going to happen. Because God knew it, it was going to happen. I could say, I know the Cowboys are going to win the Super Bowl this year. And you probably all laugh, and probably for good reason. But if I truly believe that, it's not set in stone just because I know it. But when God knows something, it's set in stone. Doesn't mean he causes it. In this case, he did cause it, but it talks about people who are believers and we become Christians through the foreknowledge of God. He doesn't cause it, but he knows it, and it's going to happen. So that's what it's talking about here. Jesus was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but he was made manifest in the last times for the sake of you. He was revealed, obviously, when he came to earth, when he started his ministry, certainly on the cross, and then the resurrection. Fully made manifest in the last times. Well, think about it. That means we're living in the last times, the end times. People ask me, do you think we're in the end times? Well, I'm absolutely sure we are. We have been for 2,000 years. So it's a long end, and we don't know when the end is going to end. But we are in the end times. Jesus could return at any moment. He says he was made manifest in the last times. Verse 21, for the sake of you, all believers, who through him, through Jesus, are believers in God, the Father, who raised him, Jesus, from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. Now, this verse is interesting because very often this idea of believing, and here he's talking about believers, so people who believe, very often that's seen as our part in salvation. God has done what he's done. Jesus died on the cross to receive that salvation, to receive that grace. We receive it through faith. We need to do that. Doesn't earn it, but that's how we receive it. But it's interesting here, he's pointing out that even that faith there, saving faith, and not just believing there is a God, but believing that Jesus was the Son, died on the cross, saving faith is only possible because of what Christ did. So even our part is based on Jesus' part. And then to take that a step further, it does not earn salvation. Don't ever think, and I don't think we would say this, but maybe there's some part of us. I did what God said, I'm in. Saving faith does not earn salvation, it receives it. Okay? We still deserve hell. God says, I will wipe that out. You have this saving faith. It doesn't earn the Son of God dying for us. It receives it. Okay? So, with that in mind now, let's look at what I think is the key focus that Peter's talking about here. And it's in verse 17. He says, if you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. And again, that triggered another wait a minute thought for me. Like, why add that throughout the time of your exile? We should have fear of God no matter in the best of times. We should still be calling on God with this healthy fear, this reverent fear. Why add that? Well, I think it's easy to think our suffering, to whatever degree, sort of deserves God's favor. It's like, God, I'm going through a tough time. I shouldn't have it this tough. I don't deserve this. I deserve a little better than this. And that's what struck me, is that, again, we can get to the point where I think we can say, God, this is too much. God, why are you allowing this? And we ask that, and the why isn't just a question, there's an element of accusation there. Have you ever had that? The things you just seem, all right, God, this is going too far. However you want to phrase it, however you want to think about it, again, too much, don't deserve, isn't fair, whatever. We can easily slip into that, and Peter's saying, absolutely not. It doesn't matter what you're going through. The whole time of our exile, this world that's not our home, or any specific situation as bad as it is, and these people had it bad. He's saying, when you call on God in prayer, don't have some attitude that, God, you sort of owe me now. I'm suffering because of my faith in you. Yeah, they were. But guess what? They're saved because of their faith in him, even though they deserved hell. And we're the same way. It doesn't matter what we're going through. It doesn't matter what we're suffering or what we're not enjoying that we think we should enjoy or be given by God. When it comes down to it, we deserve eternal punishment. And God has said, I won't give that to you. You will have an inheritance. You will spend eternity with me in heaven. Wow. That's the cost. How did we get it? Remember what we have, our salvation. Remember how we got it. The Son of God died for us. Don't ever think I deserve anything other than hell itself. I've been graciously given salvation. So what's what Peter's saying? Based on our works, we deserve hell. The cost of forgiveness was the death of Christ, and even our faith. God, I have faith. Well, you couldn't have had faith if Jesus hadn't died on the cross. That's what you have faith in. That did something. So even that is nothing for us to boast in, that I have faith. God made it possible. Jesus made it possible. It's been said, we appreciate being saved to the degree we appreciate being lost. And I think a lot of Christians don't appreciate what it means and meant to be lost. Especially those of you, and I know some directly, others I'm sure, you grew up in the church your whole life. You didn't have some story as, the amazing grace, written by the slave trader. You didn't have that, so it's hard to appreciate what it means to be lost. But if we don't appreciate that, we won't appreciate what it means to be saved. Because we're saved from, what are we saved from? Well, if I don't know what it was, well, no big deal to be saved. That makes sense? Well, that's what he's talking about here. Many don't appreciate that. Saved by grace, we often emphasize the grace. Well, emphasize the saved part. I'm saved from eternal separation from God by grace. Saved by grace. What's it mean? I think every once in a while we need to go over the basics of salvation by grace. And Peter includes these here. It starts with God's holiness. God created us to have a relationship with Him. Adam and Eve sinned, but everyone's followed in their footsteps. We can't blame it on them. We all made our own choices. God's holiness says He cannot commit sin, but the other side of that is He cannot permit sin to go eternally unpunished. That would make God unholy if He said, I'm going to just let that go. I'm going to overlook it. I'm going to forget about it. Then God wouldn't be holy. He wouldn't be separate from sin. He'd be complicit in sin. So God's holiness, He can't permit sin to go unpunished. Well, that's a problem because we've all sinned. And based on our works, judged on our works, we need to realize one sin equals being lost. It's not, well, I'm mostly good, I'm pretty good, I never did anything really bad. It is all or nothing. If you sin once, if you lied about eating the cookie that your mom made when you were 10 years old enough to know better, that's eternity in hell. Not just Hitler and Saddam Hussein and all these people. That child, that's the only thing that child ever did. Eternity in hell. Well, that's not fair. No, that's the essence of fair. God is absolutely holy. And that means we need to be absolutely holy, to spend eternity with Him. So grace also, remember we talked about this on Easter, grace doesn't make up the difference. Not like I've lived a pretty good life, God will fill in the difference with what Jesus did and I'll be all set. No, it is all or nothing. Once you sin once, you are at 0% and you need 100% righteousness. That currency of grace, that currency of salvation that powers grace. It was made possible by Jesus' suffering and death. He suffered on that cross the equivalent of eternity in hell for every person who's ever lived. Try to wrap your head around that. That's what He did. That's why Peter was making this point. You weren't redeemed with silver or gold. The Son of God suffered your eternity in hell. That's what bought your freedom. And then he ends it with saying the whole initiative for this, the plan, the offer, it was all from God. It wasn't like we said, hey God, we screwed up, here's a plan to fix things. God said, yeah, you screwed up, but I still love you. Here's a plan to fix things. It's going to cost me a lot. And you need to receive it humbly through faith. You ever wonder about the line in Amazing Grace that says, was grace that taught my heart to fear and grace my fears relieved? That last part, grace my fears relieved, but was grace that taught my heart to fear? Well, grace isn't fearful. Well, the full picture is, why do we need salvation by grace? because we deserve hell. Was grace that taught my heart to fear. Yeah. Salvation by grace, wow, that means I need saved. It means I am lost. Was grace that taught my heart to fear. Full story of grace includes why grace is necessary. And so we need to remember that. The implication is there's nothing that happens to anyone that is unfair. I mean, it is unfair that we're saved. That's not fair. If fair is what you deserve. But there's nothing that happens in my life where I'm being slighted. God, this is unfair. I don't deserve this. God says, well, I know what you deserve. You're not getting that. There's nothing else in life that we deserve to be better, or deserve not to miss out on. Now, God loves us, and He's not looking to, punish us every step or allow bad things to happen every step of the way. But don't face something and say, this is unfair. We don't want fair when it comes to God. So how aware am I of the cost of my salvation? Both what I owed and what Christ paid. And I specifically said, not do I know the cost of my salvation. As Christians, we all know the Son of God died for my sins on the cross. How aware am I? How much does it impact my day-to-day life? How much do I think about the fact? I am alive at this moment because God withheld His punishment. I had eternity waiting because God sent His Son, that Jesus died for me. Am I impacted by the cost of my salvation? Moment by moment. Well, how do we maintain that awareness? And it's like last week. We renew and maintain the right perspective. How? It's the same things we talked about last week. That personal time with God. Spending some time in His Word. Meditating on that. Reflection on what God has done in our life. Do you ever just stop and think how God has worked in your life and brought you to this point? Just allowed things, not allowed things, caused things, open doors, closed doors. How has God worked in your life? And then don't just do that alone. Do it with others. There is something powerful about sharing those things with other people. We're meant to live this life together with God. Not me and God. It is we and God. Life is an exile here on this earth, on the south side of heaven. It's not easy. I think we'd all agree. But it is better than we deserve.